I'm a sculptor, a fine art sculptor. I've been practicing for, well, since I was 15 years old, and I'm 72 now, so that's quite a long time, really. The first part of my career, more or less 50-50 really, I spent with analog technologies, and now I use digital about the last 25 years or more. I started using CAD in the mid-80s, really. I'm going to start by showing you some of the work that I did actually very early on in my career in the way that that relates now to the work that I'm doing digitally. One of the big influences really when I was a young student is Constantin Brancusi, a Romanian peasant who went to Munich, in fact, to find work, and then found himself a place in the Beaux-Arts as a postgraduate sculpture student in Paris. He's really very, very famous as being one of the founders, fathers really of contemporary modern sculpture, 20th century modern sculpture. And he's particularly renowned for coining the term truth to material, and also in the ability to really work directly rather than indirectly. So he worked for Rodin as an apprentice. He left after a while saying, "Nothing grows under great trees." But in those days, many sculptors like Rodin didn't do their own stone carvings. They'd make a clay model, lots of drawings, and then the masons would actually make that for them. Brancusi believed in actually doing things yourself, to actually work directly. And I think that throughout the most of my career as an artist, I've worked directly. I use serendipity. I invariably don't know exactly where I'm going to end up at the start. And right from the very beginnings of my work, really, working with truth to material, it's a really contentious term. This is the sort of work that Brancusi was doing. Now you can see that really at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, this work was very, very contentious. However, what's true about it is really difficult to understand, I think. If he'd actually said truth to material, process, and medium, then that might actually make a great deal more sense to me now. However, this is the work that I did before I went to art school, between the ages of about 15 and 20. I left school at 15 without any academic qualification whatsoever. Fortunately, I won a Boys Club award, actually, in the art department. And ended up, actually, Henry Moore was my referee for foundation, so I was able to get into art school without any academic qualifications on the strength of my sense of form and my ability to make sculptures of this kind. However, I'm going to jump 10 years now to my third year at the Royal College of Art, some 8 years after the work that I've just shown you there. This work's done with sawdust and glass, and it's very much to do with the behavior of the material and well, ideas of self-ordering, really. I think the first part of my career, I was really manipulating the material and controlling it. The second part, I really want the material, the processes, and the techniques to have a part to play in the outcome. Here, sawdust has been just laid on the floor in a field, and then I've pushed it forward. Actually, this came about as an accident. I'd done a piece of work, and it didn't really come up to expectations. And as I was cleaning it up, I was using a kind of snow shovel. And what you'll see here really is that the sort of forms that are made as a result of the sawdust self-ordering are really, really beautiful. And they're not made by hand. I'm emphasizing this because I don't make my work by hand anymore. Again, this was an exhibition I had in London just after I graduated. I think I was a research fellow in Cheltenham at this time. And this is an installation of sawdust. There's no glue. The sawdust is put in a sieve, and it's simply sieved up against a plane, and I've removed the plane. In this piece, similarly, I worked with sawdust for about 3 years, using other materials like glass and bricks, etc. This piece relates really to much of the work that I'm doing currently. And it's only through doing talks like this, really, that I go back and I realize how far it goes, in fact. In this work, you know, there are two things happening. Are the bricks intersecting the sawdust, or is the sawdust intersecting the bricks? The sawdust is actually kind of using its angle of repose, the natural angle at which it would fall at. And then I've used a Fibonacci sequence as a mathematical process to determine the spacing within the work. In this piece, I've just laid out some kindling on the floor. I've taken a very long straight edge and pushed it. The point being that where you can see all the distortions at the top, I didn't arrange them. They're self-organizing. And they're also relational. Everything within that is kind of relating to everything else. And I think that's important in terms of the work that I'm doing now, too. This piece actually stems from an interest I had in Islamic numerology. The notions of everything and nothing, that 0 and 9 have an equivalent value within Islam, as far as I understand anyway. I was a student in London in the 70s when notions of the Big Bang, black holes and such like were coming into being, and one was really beginning to question the very nature of reality itself. However, here what I've done is I've tied 9 knots in a piece of rope, and then 8 knots, 7 knots, 6 knots right down to 0. But in this instance, the last piece, it isn't no thing. It's still something, even though it represents a notion of 0, which for me was really quite significant at the time. And it resolved a paradox for me in terms of how could everything be nothing, how could nothing be everything. I'm sure we're all confronted with that. It still confuses kind of quantum physicists. I mean, as I understand it, quantum physics is based on granularity, indeterminacy, and relationality. And that's quite close to the way that I'm working, really. I do have a fascination with those sorts of things. I feel that maybe intuitions and hunches are really kind of emanating from the quantum. We're all made of quantum after all, you know. But I'm not a quantum physicist, I'm an artist, so I'm not going too far down that track at the moment. I worked with trees for about 15 years, basically slicing them up and rearranging them. And again, some of this work began to indicate certain processes that you do with like computing technologies, with CAD, morphing one form into another. In this piece, what I've done is I've morphed a tall, thin cone into a pyramid. And I've taken the actual proportions from the tree itself. What I've done is I've measured the average diameter of the first part of the trunk of the tree, doubled it and cut that off twice. And so that has continued throughout the piece so that it proceeds in terms of how it has grown in the first place, rather than me saying, well, I'm going to make every piece a centimeter less each time. I've actually taken the proportions from the material itself. And I think if you're going to be true to wood, then possibly timber is a way to do it. This piece here is the first indication, really, of pixelation, moving towards computer graphics. All I've done is slice up a log, cut it into sections that I've alternated each one and beginning to push the object through itself. This piece is several tree trunks that have been sliced up, and then the slices interlaced with each other. You'll see there's a kind of a hybrid form that begins to appear between the two. I'm very interested in notions of totality, of completeness, of finishedness, really. And knowing where to start and where to stop is always like kind of very difficult. The bit that happens in between is of some significance too. However, you'll see in this piece, the top left-hand corner, the last slice is just barely touching the one before it, and that said to me, stop. So I had a good reason to actually not continue going with it. And in basically taking the slices like this and moving them apart, I accidentally cloned a tree trunk and made seemingly 2 identical objects. Of course, they're opposite because they're alternating slices. All of the odd slices are in one pile, all of the even slices in another. However, again, in CAD, it's very easy to replicate objects. Once I get onto an idea, I tend to push it around a little. I do work with serendipity, so I'm never really very sure what's going to happen when I'm finished. And I also work directly with materials, never quite knowing exactly what's going to happen. So the piece on the left, we've got triplets. The one on the right, I've cut a thick slice, a thin slice, put all the thin slices in one pile, the thick slices in the other pile. So I've got a complete set. I've got 3/3 in the sculpture, and they relate to each other quite clearly, almost like mother and child, really, in a way. This piece I called Rainforest, and again, it begins to suggest a kind of pixelation. The reason I called it rainforest was in honor of Apollinaire, really, who was one of the first artists and critics, as he was back at early modernism. And he wrote a poem about rain by writing it diagonally across the page, and so the text actually looked rather like rain falling. So I think rainforest, chopping up trees, etc., seem to be appropriate, but really it's the kind of pixelization that begins to happen there that brought me to look at the computer. This is mid-80s, 1988-ish, I think. The very first computer I used was a Mac Plus. It didn't have a hard drive. This program was Mac Draw, and I discovered that if you could just draw one slice, you could replicate it and move it around quite quickly, and it would deposit and begin to kind of generate new possibilities. I started using CAD as a design tool. As I say, I worked with trees for about 15 years. And again, the kind of broken edges and the pixelation was starting to suggest computer graphics. In the previous slide, obviously on the left, I've been able to design the object before I make it. Then really software develops, computers become a lot more powerful. This is Autodesk 3D Studio Max, the first version. And it had something I'd not seen before as a tool. It had a torus knot. I've been working with the torus knot now probably for the best part of 25 years or more, I think. What fascinates me about it is that you can, in fact, go beyond what's physically possible with material. Hence the title of my talk, which is A New Order of Object. Materiality and beyond. Towards the end of my talk, I'm going to just touch on a little bit of virtual reality that I've been engaged with lately. But for the moment, the top left kind of quadrant there, you'll see it's the cross sections, the geometry of a donut form. On the right-hand side, I've brought the two cross sections, the diameters of the wheel of the donut, if you like, together until they touch in the center. And that's just about as far as you can go with physical means. The bottom left now, you can see that I've actually brought the two cross sections together so they're overlapping. And you actually then get an intersecting geometry. That doesn't happen with physical material, as far as I'm aware anyway. And on the bottom right, of course, is very nearly a sphere that the two cross sections have been brought so far together, the self-intersecting nature of the geometry begins to behave rather strangely. And that's what's fascinated me really for many years now. In 1966, I was invited to join a Higher Education Funding Council's Joint Information Systems Committee's project called CALM, Creating Art with a Layer Manufacture. And this is the very first piece of work that I did as a 3D print back then. It must have been around about, 97. It's a donut form that's been deformed and self-intersects. There's a cross-section of it there. The exterior of the object is determined by its innermost workings that basically determine where its edges are. Initially, when I started using 3D printing, I didn't think that the materials would have very much of an aesthetic quality. And I decided to cast the works into bronze. I cast several pieces into bronze. This piece has been burnished to almost a mirror finish. And the reason for that, and that is because, as you'll see, the various elements within it pass through each other. But then, well, if I can point to it, round about there, what we've got is a reflection of itself within itself. And so really, I guess it begins to unite the virtual with the real. I think reflections must have been our very, very first experience of a virtual reality, really. Probably from underneath the sea looking up as opposed to looking down, but still, nevertheless, a reflection in a mirror is something that we take absolutely for granted. This piece is ABS plastic. It's done with a fused deposition technique and a soluble support structure. Now, I couldn't possibly conceive of this and then make it. It comes from actually engaging actively with the process of modeling in a virtual environment. And the way things behave in there are absolutely wonderful. One point I'd like to make, really referring back to the tree work, is that every slice within the tree is sequential. It belongs where it is. You can't move it about anywhere else, really. all of the larger kind of components in this piece started off as spheres, and the tentacle-like parts started off as cylinders. And so by deforming them with CAD, I've been able to produce this object. There's a donut in there, but it's invisible. You can't really see the torus form. But that's what's causing much of the relationship between the various elements within it. And then again here, taking advantage of the FDM process and soluble support structures, I'm able to produce extremely complex and yet extremely beautiful objects that just wouldn't be possible to make any other way. It's not my intention, incidentally, to emulate reality in the virtual. What I find is that I get excited by exploring the possibilities within the virtual world and then bringing them back into the real world. A real, of course, being rather a contentious kind of term. Anyway, I worked with these for quite some time. My whole process really has to do with just, exploration, discovery, realization, and then followed by meaning and understanding. So I think in order to be successful at anything, in the first instance, you need the ability, then you need the desire, followed by the discipline. If any one of those three things are missing, then you'll probably not succeed. Working in color now with 3D printing. Color's been sort of getting much better over the last few years. This is a paper print, actually. It's printed with A4 paper, one slice at a time, and color is printed into the perimeter of every slice as they're stuck together, and then it's been burnished. So I've been very excited by the possibilities of using color, really, I guess, because it wasn't there in the first place. I was working with pure form. So beginning to look at relationships between surface and object, and color and form, really. I rarely use symbolism, but here I've taken an image that I downloaded off the internet of some pebbles, and then I've made a form that is kind of pebble-ish. It's also a gypsum material, which is plaster, so it's an image of stone now made out of stone, but it's dealing with the visual ambiguity as well, I guess. So when we look at it from another angle, of course, then you get a completely different kind of feeling about the work. Again here, very simple CAD tools, really. In this case, what I've done is I've applied a bitmap, and with the UV coordinates, I've used a shrink wrap technique on the geometry, which then generated this absolutely amazingly beautiful thing. I don't really think of these things as being mine. It's not really about expressing myself. I'm more concerned really with exploring and finding, and then sharing that by saying, wow, look at what I found, isn't this amazing? It's not that I'm amazing, I think that it's amazing, really. So more recently, this is a work that I've actually been doing this year, experimenting further with the possibility of applying various different color finishes onto 3D prints. Again, here, the color is applied in a way that is rather unusual, because I've simply put the image directly onto the form in CAD. And this was a striped image, so as the stripes follow the nature of the form, they're expanding and contracting, which actually helps you to understand it. It kind of takes you that little bit further in terms of what's going on there. And again, how would you do that with traditional means? I really think that these new technologies now in Industry 4 are giving us tools the like of which we've never had before. I'm sure that Michelangelo would have just loved to have got his hands on them, but it goes way beyond whatever could be done, really, right from classical Greek sculpture through to current times, simply because you can do things in that virtual environment that are just not possible in the real world. This is a piece I made just a couple of weeks ago. I was rather surprised in a way that it came out. And by applying that striped bitmap on it, it has wrapped itself around it and follows the geometry as it goes. I get my rewards from doing it, I don't get one of these every day. I work every day, but very occasionally something special comes out of it that I can't really anticipate or expect. And you'll only really get that, I think, by working directly. More recently, I've begun to play a little with some VR, not as extensively as the previous speaker or some of the other speakers today. I'm just about to enter it fully. I've got a new computer coming, and I'm ready to go in there. It's difficult to see where the object is in this particular configuration because the world that it's in is kind of technicolored, multicolored, and so you'll be able to kind of I don't know if you can make out an object within that world, but this is it from the outside, and then that's it from the inside. So one of the things I'm really excited about at the moment is being able to make very large, like VR installations of sculptures that you can then walk into and experience in different ways. Rather like this piece here, which is something, again, that I produced maybe just a few weeks ago. And what fascinated me about this is that there aren't any textbooks that will tell you how to render an image of this sort. I mean, it really was quite an extraordinary discovery for me, because once you move into that object, various things begin to happen. I mean, I had no idea, really, the sort of the wonderland that I was going to find inside there in a VR headset. You know, once you put that headset on, as the previous speaker said, you're in a different world, you know. I mean, and it's very believable. Again, I'm not interested in emulating the real world in virtual reality. In fact, I'm not really interested in VR so much as I'm interested in RV. It's just absolutely amazing to be able to, in this environment, to be able to just walk through these membranes and into other wonderful technicolored spaces. And I think this is my last slide now, so thank you very much for your attention.